Africa has a $2 trillion economy with about a third of its 54 countries seeing annual GDP growth of more than 6%. Of the top 10 fastest growing economies in the world, 6 are in Africa. Mobile technology is exploding. The continent is home to 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land, and Africa has an abundance of natural resources. In addition, the Harvard Business Review says Africa will soon also have the world's largest workforce. And it is with this context that I welcome you to the CNBC Africa debate, coming to you live from Davos, Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. With Africa's population set to rise to 2 billion by 2050, what actions are needed now to ensure sustainable and inclusive growth? Joining me, President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria, President John Dramani Mahama of Ghana, Winnie Byanyima, Executive Director of Oxfam International, Julian Roberts, Group Chief Executive of Old Mutual PLC, Doreen Noni, Creative Director of fashion label Eskado Bird in Tanzania, and Aliko Dangote, President and CEO of the Dangote Group. Before we discuss the next billion, perhaps it's important to look at how we are dealing with the current billion, and I'm going to open to President Jonathan. On the 27th of February, Nigeria will be celebrating 100 years of existence, which is why we have the dominance of Nigerian scarves on the platform. Do you believe that Nigeria has done what it needs to do in the context of Africa to this point?
Thank you. In the first place, no African country could say clearly that we have done what we're supposed to do within this period. For Nigeria, Nigeria existed before the amalgamation. The amalgamation was historical, bringing the Northern Protectorate and the Southern Protectorate of Nigeria to form the modern Nigeria. But within these 100 years, we've tried, and of course, one of the things that really contributed to this slow growth in African countries was first, we experienced colonial domination. When you have been run by another country, the growth is based on what they want. Nigeria and most African countries were used as settlements for primary commodities to feed the industries in Europe. When we gained independence in 1960, we are now to map out our own vision and carry on our own mission for the growth of our economy. But somehow, the political circumstances then was very temporal. We had a lot of military interventions in the politics. We can say that Nigeria stabilized from 1999, when the present political dispensation came into being. Before this time, the longest period that politicians run the country was about 4 years, 3 months. That was 1999 to 1983. So it's now, and most of African countries, if you look at it, you talk about we have stable economic growth in quite a number of African countries because there's stability in most African countries now. We still have sour areas of flash points like the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and others. We are not completely out of it, but majority of the African countries are now enjoying stable governance. And I always say, before you talk about economic growth, the political stability is key. Because investors who didn't want to invest in areas or countries that they don't know the next president, they don't know the next policy, they don't know the next law that will come up. And now most African countries are relatively stable. I think started countries like Ghana, South.
Well, let's bring President Mahama in at this stage. Ghana has been a star of West Africa. Do you believe that African governments are going a long way to creating an enabling environment for business on the continent?
Yeah, I guess I'll just continue from where my brother left off. We are enjoying in Africa what I call the democracy dividend. We have a period we call the lost generation, that is the 70s and 80s, where, I mean, you couldn't tell what government would be in power the next day. I mean, it was a blur of unconstitutional governments and military dictators. Ghana started her democratic journey in 1992, and I believe that the progress we're seeing, the economic development, is all part of the dividend of good governance, respect for human rights, rule of law. It's created an enabling environment that allows not only foreigners to come and invest, but for Ghanaians to also invest and create businesses, create jobs for people. It's created an atmosphere for our young people to be creative, innovative, to participate in the ICT revolution. And I think that that is all helping the progress that we're making.
Aliko, in doing research for this debate, I was reviewing a couple of your interviews, and I picked up one that you did with the Lagos Business School, where you made a comment along the lines of, it's only lazy people who wait for government to create an enabling environment. And obviously the proof is in the pudding. Can we get you to elaborate on that statement?
Well, yes, you're right. You see, majority of foreign investors, because they don't really go into Africa, they don't really check what Africa is all about. They stay just by reading newspapers and co. And what they normally do is that, okay, fine, you know, for example, today we are going to have an election in Nigeria sometime in November or so. They say, okay, fine, we want to wait and see the outcome of the election. After the election, if after, we have, finished the election successfully, everything goes well, then they want to see the stability of the government. And then that will take them 2 years. By 2 years, politicians will start, talking about politics again. Then they have to wait. They fall back again and wait. So really, when you look at it, I think today what they need to look at is that, look, there is no government that will be against business. So you go ahead, you invest. The next government that will come in, even after finishing either 8 years or 10 years, they will also be, they are also going to be pro-business. So if they are going to be pro-business, it means that you are not going to really make a mistake by investing. Once you start, you have to continue. And then you look at it, obviously, yes, in any place or in any business where the road is high, the risk is there. But our own risk is mainly perceived, not real risk. That is the issue. And unfortunately for us, in Africa, we are not really very good at telling our own story. But I think things are changing. People are beginning to understand that, look, things are going very, very well.
Winnie, let's bring you in here. And President Jonathan a little earlier mentioned Central African Republic, South Sudan, obviously making headlines across the globe. The Africa that you see could be very different to the picture that's been presented to this point in the discussion. We are seeing hundreds of thousands of people being displaced in those territories. As Oxfam, you are working on poverty alleviation and human rights across the continent. If you could enter the discussion.
Yeah, I want to agree that very much is positive on the continent, and it's so good to hear it from both the private sector and from government. There's a lot that's positive. Growth is positive, even though I think that sometimes it's overplayed. It's like 5% growth, but then the population is 3% growth, so what's there really? And when we look at that growth, we see that it's leaving millions and millions of Africans behind. And that is partly the reason for the conflict. We've come out with a report that we call Working for the Few, pointing out to the dangers in growing inequality, not just because it's income inequality, but because it's also causing and driving other forms of inequality and driving us to more and more instability and more insecurity and trapping people into a vicious cycle of poverty, of exclusion. We're seeing that. We put out a statistic that has attracted everybody, that 85 wealthiest people in the world, whom you can sit comfortably on a double-decker bus, own the same wealth as half the population of the world. And we're seeing that there's something wrong with that, not just because it is immoral, but because we also see that those same people, those same companies, actually also hijack political power. And institutions, public institutions, start to work in their favor against the majority. So we're seeing a concentration of wealth and power that is excluding, locking out millions of people, and that's driving instability and insecurity in the world.
We're certainly going to come back to income inequality and economic inclusion. It's going to form a significant part of this debate. Julian, I'd like to bring you in here. Old Mutual has a very strong African heritage, listed in both Johannesburg and on the London Stock Exchange. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you're present in 8 countries on the African continent at this stage. What is your view, an external view looking in?
It's slightly different, but let me start with the absolute positive. We wouldn't be investing so much in the rest of Africa if we didn't absolutely believe that Africa is going to be the success story over the next few decades. You know, when you look at some of the facts that you just gave, you know, 60% of the available agricultural land is in Africa. You know, 20% of 50% of the people are under 20. So it's going to have 25% of the global workforce by 2050 without any of the pension problems of the aging people. So there is a huge opportunity. Already 700 million people have a mobile phone. 170 million people have access to the internet. So Africa is on the move, and it's moving forward. But I still think there is significant work to do to make sure that we do have that enabling platform. So although there is huge growth, you know, we as a group have invested over $1.5 billion in infrastructure. We had one of our projects nationalized in one African country. Now, if you don't have a sound enabling environment, people aren't going to invest because they must know that they can get the reward. And there does have to be more of a partnership. Africa cannot succeed without a real handshake between private enterprise and the public sector. So there is more that countries need to do to make sure that there is that enabling platform so that investment can come through, that education and the skills can be developed, and then there will be no holding Africa back.
Doreen, you run a successful business in Tanzania in the fashion industry, but you're also our global shaper voice,
Yes.
the youth. And we referred earlier to this demographic dividend, which could become a problem if we don't deliver on promises that we have made, that Africa has made to the youth. We've seen 2 decades of very strong growth, and now that economic inclusion is incredibly important to filter down to the young people of Africa. To bring a stat into perspective here, the World Bank says that 5 million people every year make the transition from childhood to adulthood. That means that they turn 15. So 5 million people annually are making that transition. We spoke earlier of the fact that we are going to have the youngest workforce in the world very soon. Let's get your thoughts, and perhaps you're going to force the change for Africa.
Well, like Winnie said here, I think there's only positive things that are going to happen in Africa. However, I feel strongly in order for us, the next generation, to actually come and make a positive impact, we need to change our mindset. We need to know our responsibilities to our country, and we need to have a determined and aggressive attitude, right? It's a pity because I feel as if in Tanzania that a lot of the young people are not feeling empowered right now. I feel as if maybe if we look into our educational systems, a lot of the youth feel the need to go out and look for employment. We're not trained from a young age to actually to have entrepreneurial skills that are actually going to come and benefit the economy in the long run. I completely agree with what Mr. Dangote said. I feel as if, you know, like we need to have about the lazy people. I think we need to have a proactive youth, and we can only get our continent to have inclusive growth if we're educated and have open-minded and change our mindset.
Winnie, you'd like to interject there?
I want to interject on this issue of an enabling business environment, and maybe also ask our presidents to give us their experience here. Because when I hear enabling business environment to bring the resources of the private sector, which we need, and look at what has been happening in Africa, what I see is that there's been just a race to the bottom. You know, when you look at the tax breaks, the concessions, the illicit flows of funds, you can't get a more enhanced business environment than you have in Africa. I mean, it's been a race to the bottom in terms of attracting business into the continent. And I'm thinking we now need a race to the top so that we have policies and regulations that protect the people's rights, human rights, the environment, and that reduce poverty. And how are we going to have these when there is elite capture of lawmaking processes? Can a poor person stand and be elected? Can a parliament make a law that favors ordinary people and not the lobbyists who have the money? So there is a capture of wealth and power that's not letting us create an environment where business can do good, make profits, and also free people from poverty.
Are you asking the presidents to,
to
make
tell us,
widespread changes in regulatory regimes?
No, to help us know how we can unlock this, not favor
Mahama.
the rich against the poor?
Can you answer, Winnie?
Yeah, we can do it by creating space for the private sector. I mean, when most of our countries, emerged from colonial domination, we believe that the state must enter business and provide everything for the citizens. So the state was in transportation, the state was in electricity generation, the state dominated telecoms. I mean, just name any sector. Even consumer goods, there were state enterprises producing consumer goods. What we're saying now is create space for the private sector to take that. It's better at doing it than government is at doing it. So leave that to the private sector. There are still, look at what we've done in telecoms. Just allowing the private sector to come in with investment and innovation. Telecoms have exploded across the continent. We still have electricity, we have water and all that, state dominated. Why don't you allow independent power producers to come in, invest their monies, produce power, feed it into the grid, and make it available to business to grow? So I think that creating space for the sector is good. At the time we needed to attract investments into the country, we gave very wide tax breaks. A lot of our countries are beginning to change that now. We have just passed a new Ghana Investment Promotion Center bill, which changes the incentives that are given and make them more realistic to our current situation. And so you look at these things as you go along and then you adjust them. But I just wanted to make a point about inequality that was raised. A new class of poor people was generated in Africa in the 70s and 80s when we all went through structural adjustment programs. We were asked to withdraw all subsidies, especially to the poorest of the poor who were in agriculture. We're not allowed to subsidize agriculture. And yet in the West, agriculture was heavily subsidized. And so it made our economies heavily import dependent for even food, chicken, and things that we had a comparative advantage to produce to feed ourselves. Rice. If you look at the huge amounts of money we're spending in importing rice in my country, $500 million every year to import rice. And we have the capacity to grow enough rice to feed ourselves. And so I do think that structural adjustment, created some problems. Now the international financial institutions agree with us. They say, oh, yes, you can subsidize your farmers. And so we're making a change. We're seeing agricultural production go up. We're seeing farmers rising to the occasion. We're changing the orientation of our farmers from being just peasant producers into seeing agriculture as a business. So a lot of things are changing. And we're doing social protection programs to make people feel inclusive. The poor and vulnerable have nothing. And so cash transfers to the poorest households, all these things are taking place in Africa.
President Mahama, you mentioned the power sector. And President Jonathan has been brave on that front by privatizing the power environment in Nigeria. I think it would be great for us to get a temperature check on how that privatization is delivering on the power promises for Nigeria.
Thank you. Before I comment on the power, let me actually concur with President Mahama. The issue when Dangote raised was not that government has no role to play, but policies and programs of government are key to encourage investment. And of course, like most African countries, we take Nigeria as an example. Before this time, government has monopoly of almost everything. But now we have opened up the ports, the airports. Of course, we've just spoke about power, agri. If I have time, I'll go to agri. But specifically on power that you asked. Before this, Nigeria is made up of a federal government and 36 states that are semi-autonomous, as sub-national governments. But before this time, even those 36 states are not allowed by law to generate power for commercial purposes. They can't generate for rural development. But for commercial purposes, they were not allowed. Private sector people were not involved in power at all. Even people who generate power for their factories, there are a lot of captive power that are not fed into the national grid because they are not allowed to sell by law. It's only the one generated by the federal government and distributed by the federal government. So now the government can no longer cope, and that's why we moved into the privatization.
Is it working for you?
It's working. The generation and distribution is now exclusively in the hands of the private sector. The transmission is still government, but being managed by a private sector consultant. We've just concluded the privatization, and already Nigerians will tell you that the number of hours that Nigerians enjoy life per day is increasing. Somebody who lives somewhere near Abuja told me within this period that for about 20 days, they never had any interruption. But before this time, we talked about a few hours a day. So, and this is the beginning. In fact, the rate at which it's moving, because there are some of the companies that have almost doubled their generation capacity within a short period. And they will even do more, because in Nigeria we have gas. And so any investor can. But when government gets interested in business, and that's what the president of Ghana said, it's always a problem. And in Nigeria, we now say that the economy has to be driven by the private sector. Government only provides the enabling environment in the sense that we come up with policies to protect your investments. We come up with laws to protect your investment. So when you're investing, you're very sure that you can take your capital. Nobody is limiting you in terms of how you move
President
money.
Jonathan,
yes.
We've been singing the good news story, and Julian, I'll come to you in just a moment. But I also need to tackle some of the tougher issues, and that you mentioned oil. You are losing 20% of your oil production in Nigeria daily. That accounts to about 200,000 barrels daily. It points to corruption in the oil sector. What are you doing about it?
The issue is not corruption. It's quite unfortunate that every negative thing, people find simple answers to it. Mentioning corruption seems to be solving every problem. Nobody wants to think properly again.
But what is happening? What is happening to the oil?
Anything that is not happening the way it's supposed to happen in Africa, the simple answer is corruption. I don't believe it. You see, we have challenges. Luckily, I am from the Niger Delta, the part of the country that the oil comes from. And I know the issues very well. Well, the statistics vary, and nobody can say even exactly. Even if you ask the oil companies, sometimes they give you different statistics. But the basic thing, what we are suffering today, started from community agitation, that they produce oil, but they were not getting enough benefit. And community youths started vandalizing oil facilities.
President Jonathan, I want Julian Roberts to come in here. You were signaling, sir, that you want to interject.
I really wanted to come back before that question because, you know, why am I so positive about Africa is really just what both of our presidents have said. In 2013, we were invited in to Ghana and Nigeria, and we bought insurance businesses in that country. And there is a commitment for us to help build the insurance sector. So there is a partnership between governance and private enterprise. So we are going to take the skill sets that we've got in South Africa and in the SADC region, and we're going to take that into these countries and help build the insurance and the banking sector. We'll build financial inclusion. And by building those businesses, we will employ more people. And therefore, we'll deal with the poverty. So the more and more private enterprise comes in and helps generate growth moving forward, more people will be employed. But it takes a long time and a long journey to get there.
Winnie?
I have a lot of respect for my senior brothers here, the presidents in Africa, but I want to throw back the challenge, because when the governments withdraw from the private sector, it is good. From the roles that the private sector can do better, that is good. When they focus on regulating, on ensuring that the private sector does what it should do, that is good. But when you look across Africa and you see that the wealth or of the natural resources isn't creating jobs for African people, that we are still just piping minerals out of a hole and selling off without creating jobs for our people, isn't that the role of the government?
Winnie, I've got a short-term solution. I'm going to throw it to Aliko here. There is a short-term solution, because when I was doing research for this debate and looking at the current billion people on the continent that we are currently supporting, there is a glaring gap in intra-Africa trade, which currently only sits at 11%. Surely we can unlock those markets. Aliko, I know that this is speaking to your business. Can't we unlock those markets where we start trading with those billion people? Imagine, come 2050, when it's 2 billion people, we'll be completely self-sustainable as the African continent.
Well, I think, yes, when you look at it really, people are always even underestimating what Africa could be, because my vision is that if you look at Africa of 2050, we should have a united Africa, Africa Economic Community, where we have only one common market, where there will be free movement of goods and services and people. And today, for example, somebody like me, even though my own is a little bit better, because I'm from Nigeria, so we have 15 countries in the ECOWAS community. But I need a visa in almost, 38 countries, which means an American has more access into Africa than myself, because majority of them, they can go to the airport and get the visa and pass through. So I think what we need to do is to look at, okay, what does the future hold for us? What it holds for us is that if you look at it, even if today in Africa we've been growing the last 15 years at about 5.5%, and this 5.5%, majority of the countries really have no light, no power at all. So can you imagine if we have sufficient infrastructure or sufficient power? And not only that, going forward, now you say, okay, fine. If we are going to even grow at 4.5% for the next till 2050, which is about 37 years, it means that Africa will have a total GDP of about 9 trillion. 9 trillion, that's twice China today. And it can happen, it's possible. You see, but what we need to do is that the governments really, they have to make a policy where Africa will not only be supplying raw materials.
It's about beneficiation.
Yes. So if you are now going to do something in Africa, yes, we'll give you the permit, but let's give you 4 or 5 years of which come and set up the factory there. Everything is there, cheap labor is there, the market is there, you sell some there, and then you export. But what is happening is that majority of our mineral resources, they've been exported and processed, and they process them and bring them to sell to us at about 10% the cost. So I think these are the areas that we need to look at.
It's certainly something that Minister Aganga, Trade and Industry Minister in Nigeria, is forging ahead with, the industrial revolution in Nigeria. Doreen, I want to bring you in here. Come back to the opportunity. 1 billion people on the African continent. Imagine what that could do for your fashion business if you had free access to them. Imagine what will happen by 2050 if you have access to 2 billion. Can you get as excited as me?
Well, certainly more money in my bank account. However, I just want to give a small example of a Chinese man who came from China, a little village in China, and flew all the way, saw the opportunity in Africa, set up his little workshop in Nigeria, and now he was still trading in Nigeria and still supplying clothes within Africa, but he also had his little workshop in China. But now he's come to employ over 3,000 people within Africa. He's earning over $1 million at the end of the year. And it's because he saw the opportunity and he decided to come into the country and provide good quality products. Fair enough, it will be a great opportunity if infrastructure, we improve our roads. Like one of my problems is distribution. If I'm getting orders from, let's say West Africa or Southern Africa, I'm like, okay, so how do I get my garments over there? I have to, DHL and it's a bit costly for my pocket and the person that's receiving it. However, if I could have, I don't know, maybe found another way to get the garments there, then it will be distributed further. But my point is this, that at the end of the day, quality, we still need to be as much as it's good to have all these
Julian, I want to, we are running out of time. Doreen, I'll come back to you in a second. Look at Old Mutual, its position. 8 countries on the African continent. I'm not letting this intra-trade issue go. I want a resolution on this panel before we leave today that we're going to open up Africa to one another. How many countries would you be accessing on the African continent if you could move freely? If it took shorter than 10 days to get a visa to visit Nigeria?
No, it's absolutely the case. Our target should be 80% by 2050 of the inter-country trade flows. That should be the target. We have to do a number of different things. It's the visa process must be better. We must, in West Africa, it can take a month to get goods imported. We've got to, that's why I keep talking about the enabling platform. We've got to get rid of these barriers. The opportunities are there, and then trade will flow.
This is low-hanging fruit, and I'm now going hard on the regulators in the room. Open up Africa, sir.
Basically, you see, the issue of visa, I don't think it's a major problem. In Nigeria, where even I've come up with the policy that you can get a visa at the airport if you're entering to encourage business people. Before this time, our visa maximum was to be 2 years.
So is that operational, visa on arrival?
Yes, now we can give you up to 10 years. But the issue and the key problem where inter-African trade is limited is transportation infrastructure. For you to move from one African country to the other, sometimes you have to go to Europe, go outside Africa for you to access another African country.
So we need to talk to the airlines.
Yeah, of course, airlines, rail system, until you get this road linkages, until you get the infrastructure in place. The political decision is simple. A president can just wave anything overnight. But until we get the infrastructure, inter-African trade becomes a limited factor.
President Mahama, can you weigh in at this point?
Yeah, I would say I feel ashamed that trade between our countries is only 11%. It's unacceptable. We have these protocols on the books where we agree that goods and services and people can move freely amongst our countries. But the reality of the fact is that if you're taking products from Nigeria and bringing them to Ghana, you have to go through like 5, 6, 7 border checks. And at every border check, the amount of money you have to pay, especially in illegal collections, is so much. And so it needs a certain political will to be able to do that. And I can see that that will is beginning to develop. In Dakar, a few months ago, we passed the common external tariff. And so that paves the way for us to start to create a free trade area in our country, in our sub-region. But like I said, we need to take down the barriers, take down the border posts. One of the things we're doing is joint border posts between our countries so that there's just one border post to clear. But how lovely it would be if we just took them out completely and allowed people to move freely across.
Can I open to the audience at this stage? How do you feel about that opportunity? Intra-African trade, what do we need to do about it? Again, if you can just signal and we will deploy a mic. We have a taker at the back of the room there, please, if we could deploy a mic. While we're waiting for it to get there, Aliko, the other thing that we need to touch on is entrepreneurship. It was mentioned earlier by Doreen and how that can help the youth with economic inclusion. Again, reviewing your interviews with the Lagos Business School, I see that you give a lot of your time to lecturing about entrepreneurship to youth.
Yes, well, the whole thing about entrepreneurship, there are a couple of things. There is what you call the risk, also the stamina, the appetite in doing things. When you look at this, we have what it takes in Africa for people to actually get into business. Unfortunately, one of the areas that I think we need to improve on is actually access to, financing. Access to financing, especially when you look at small, medium enterprises, it is almost very difficult for them to have money, to have access to financing that is affordable. Because if you are going to borrow money at 20% and above, it might be very, very tough for you to take a risk. Because any mistake, you'll just go under. So I believe in our own setting in Africa, based on entrepreneurship, there are quite a lot of people who are very, very, very entrepreneurial and who really have the market. I mean, what do you need? If you take the risk, the market is there. So you really don't have to do much.
As you have proved with your success. If I could go to the back of the room, please.
Yeah. I think for the development of any country, infrastructure is very important, particularly for the airports. Airports is the main driving of the economy. And also second is power. I think the countries has to more focus on the airports. Airports is the front face of the country. It is not required government has to run the airports. There is companies, so many companies are there. The model number of countries, Istanbul and other airports. If you take the Istanbul, Turkey, the whole economy is, earlier 10 years back, there is almost inflation is the double digit. Today, all the 90% of the airport is privatized, and the economy completely is coming to single digit inflation. I think the infrastructure is the main important, particularly the airports and other connectivity, and the power is very important. It's not required the money. Today, there's so much of entrepreneurship is there in the world. If you put it a full governance, the number of people is interested to participate in this. I think the government has to focus more on the infrastructure and call for the global. Why should a government has to run the airports? And it is you take in India today, most of the airport is privatized. A number of countries are privatizing like that. Like power also, you have to privatize in this. That is my suggestion. This.
Thank you very much. If I could just remind you, please, to stand as you ask a question to our panelists. Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Have we got a microphone? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ebuka Obiuchendu, from a global shaper from the Lagos Hub in Nigeria. I think it's impossible to talk about all of this integration without mentioning security or the lack of it. And I know Mr. President of Nigeria would agree with me that a lot of the problems we have with security in my country are not even by Nigerians. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are going forward, maybe to both presidents, on how to tackle that issue. Thank you.
Security. President Mahama, would you like to start?
Yeah, there can be no development and progress without security and stability. And so that is one of the issues we need to address. Unfortunately, as a result of the need to commit more funding to the social sectors, health and education, a lot of us in our countries, forgot the need to continue to strengthen security. And so you would find that when the incident in Mali happened, it took France to come in to give us breathing space to mobilize our troops to be able to go into Mali and help. And so when it comes to security, I must say that we do have a problem. We need to pay attention to security as well.
Let's bring Nigeria into the security discussion. You've got a terror group, Boko Haram, operating in northern Nigeria. But you're not alone. In East Africa, we've got Al-Shabaab. How are you reacting to these terror forces? And thank you for bringing us to the security issue.
Of course, security is key to the development of any nation, because if people cannot move freely, then of course it will inhibit investment, no doubt about that. We have the Boko Haram challenge. Of course, you know that the first attack was even in Abuja. Boko Haram didn't start from Maiduguri. It started right there at the federal capital. The UN building was bombed. The headquarters of the Nigerian police was bombed. That's how it was. It was quite bad. But now we've been able to push it to not the whole of even 3 states, but a section, especially a border area between Nigeria and Cameroon. And that is where we need a lot of cooperation between the countries. I will even have a meeting with Paul Biya next week for our security to move freely. Sometimes the Nigerian securities could get these people up to the boundary area, but immediately they cross, you now have inhibition in terms of the approach. But we are working very hard. We are always changing.
Is Boko Haram the biggest threat to Nigeria's security?
In terms of security for now, yes, of course, the greatest challenge we have.
Winnie, I want you to add your voice here.
Yeah, I would like to say that Africa is really moving down a road that is of more and more insecurity. Next to Latin America, Africa is the most unequal continent in the world. 6 out of the 10 countries that are most unequal are in Africa today. And what we are seeing is more and more citizen insecurity as we have in Latin America. And it is an expression of the majority of people feeling locked out of governance, feeling that the rules are rigged in favor of a few. And unless we address this question of inclusion, of creating jobs, both economic and political inclusion, I'm afraid insecurity will continue to rise. So we need to tackle the issues of economic inclusion, creating jobs, good jobs for people. And secondly, in terms of addressing questions like terrorism today, I think we are putting a lot in a military victory to terrorism. And that will continue to elude us, I'm afraid.
One of the top tweets coming through is that we are losing our talented youth. A quick comment there, Doreen, from you before we go back. And if I could get a mic to this gentleman here. Thank you.
Sorry,
we're losing our talented youth.
Do I think we're losing
Do you think we are? A tweet coming through on our feed at the moment.
Define losing exactly. Losing how?
As in they're leaving the country, a talent drain.
Oh, yes, brain drain.
Have you thought of
Certainly.
leaving?
No, never. Well, I left. I was fortunate enough to get educated abroad, but I have been raised by entrepreneurial parents, and whenever people ask me why did I go back home, I say that Africa needs me.
Well, it's good that Africa needs you, and you are staying. So if you could go ahead with your question.
Okay.
Just hold it straight up to you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Jimovia. I'm from Nigeria. I will speak on intra-African trade. One major problem between African countries have to do with the issue of doubt, mistrust, and probably xenophobia. Because just a few years ago, it took a whole presidency to intervene when one of the countries, I won't mention the name, refused to allow Nigerian business people in on account of the fact that they didn't have yellow fever cards. And yellow fever has been eradicated all over the world. But that country insists you must have yellow fever vaccination before you get in there. You get into the United States, no one asks you about yellow fever vaccination. You get into Britain, no one asks you. You get into Ghana, no one asks you. But Nigerians go into this particular country, they stop them and maybe even deport them. So I call that mistrust and xenophobia, nothing else. Until it required it was going to create a whole diplomatic row before that country backed down a little bit, then it was resolved. That's number one. That also creates problem of intra-African trade. Mistrust.
I'm going to leave it to one comment per person. Okay. And again, that comes back to allowing the free movement of goods and people across the African continent.
Very correct. Finally, please allow me this. We have this issue of international media. I don't mean CNBC. Please, trust me.
Well, thank you very much. Otherwise, I will cut your mic.
They have this issue of what I would say stereotyping of Africans and African businesses and African people in terms of the fact that corruption, they say, you type in Google about Africa and business opportunity, they tell you there's corruption there. They tell you there's wars. They tell you there's fighting.
This is your final point.
It's final point. You have about 300,000 Google entries on negativism and stereotyping of inferiority issues about Africa, whereas you have only about few hundreds of opportunities and economic development. Thank you so much. That's very important.
Thank you very much, sir. If we could just pass the mic to the gentleman behind you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm Arnaud Ventura. I'm one of the YGL group members. I'm the co-founder of Planet Finance Group, a microfinance group, and I would like to address the social inclusion issue. I believe one of the major issues of the world today, and specifically of Africa, is the issue of inclusion, social inclusion with increasing inequality. I'm obviously focusing on financial inclusion. And I believe financial inclusion, and specifically in Africa, which is a country of millions of entrepreneurs, can be a recipe for success. We manage many banks, microfinance banks in Africa. We face issues related to regulations, related to attracting investors to this sector. So I would like to ask our audience, how do they rank this issue, financial inclusion, in the order of priority, and what kind of thought do they have to promote financial inclusion in Africa?
Let's do a quick test across the panel in terms of where you rank financial inclusion, economic inclusion, out of 10. President Jonathan.
Thank you. When you talk about this inclusion, one has to know, but listen tentatively to the lady, you have to know where Africa is coming from.
Before we talk about the solutions, I want you to give me a 1 to 10 in terms of how important it is to you.
No, it is.
Economic inclusion.
No, it is. And that is why for Nigerian government, we have taken a lot of drastic steps, just that we don't have time. In agriculture, because that is one area that we can create wealth. We want to create the middle level. We're encouraging young...
President Jonathan, is it a 9? Is it an 8? Out of 10, in terms of your priorities, financial inclusion. 7, 6, 5. You're not going to give me a number.
No, you don't deal with numbers that way.
President Mahama, can I get a number out of President Mahama of Ghana?
Let me just make a quick point.
A number? What? A number, sir?
It's a top priority. As government, withdraws and creates space for the private sector, one of government's major responsibility is to ensure economic inclusion, distribute the fruits of growth, so that everybody feels they have a stake in the economic progress of the country. So it's a 10.
A 9. A 9 and 8.
A 10.
A 10, got it. Winnie, I'd assume it's a 10 on your agenda as well. You've been referring to it.
Well, and other priorities, but it's a top one. Economic, financial inclusion.
All right, so we've got 2 10s so far. Julian Roberts?
3 10s.
3 10s. Doreen?
4 10s.
4 10s. Aliko?
6 10s.
President Jonathan, Aliko's counted you in. You never gave me a number.
We're saying the same thing.
Are you giving me a 10? Is it 6? We've got 6 10s on financial inclusion.
The numbers. The number does not communicate to anybody. We wanted to just inform Africans what we are doing and what we believe most African countries must do. The lady talks about the issue of policies of government not favoring the poor people. Must we continue to get poor people that cannot afford food? That is one thing you must do. You must create wealth in our societies. It means that you must, in terms of education, in terms of skill acquisition and creating opportunities. Before this time, African countries deal with primary produce, either raw farm produce or raw minerals. We are busy exporting crude oil. We're supposed not to export crude oil. We're supposed to export refined products. So these are the areas that create jobs and create wealth, so that the people can afford. The days of government continue to subsidize hydrocarbons, subsidize everything is over. In agriculture now, what we do is to encourage the farmers. We subsidize agriculture differently. For example, just on Monday today, I launched what we call dry season farming. And one of my state governors out of the 36 said that because of a new method of approach to farming, the business approach, instead of farming being looked at as if a rural development program, he comfortably told us that in the state, there's no poor person again. Of course, I'm just giving an example. So the issue is not how will government continue to subsidize and feed people, but how do you create wealth so that the least person in society can comfortably walk into a supermarket or any market and procure and buy what he needs.
Understood, President Jonathan. If I can go to the back of the room, I haven't been ignoring you.
My name is...
You can just speak directly into the mic, please.
Okay. My name is Bousso Dramé. I'm a global shaper from Dakar, Senegal. And I have a question for the panelists. There's a growing sense of interest from foreign investors in Africa, which is now presented as the new El Dorado. Yet it's very clear that these investors are not motivated by sheer altruism. So how do we as Africans ensure that we cater to our own interests and use this foreign direct investment and leverage private sector as a platform for sustainable economic and social growth? Thank you.
Any takers on the panel?
Yeah.
President Mahama?
Yes, foreign investment is important, but growing the domestic private sector is also important. And so in the past, we were used to giving incentives to foreign investors to come and invest, but not extending those same incentives to our own domestic private sector. I think that is changing now. With the new regulations coming out and the new laws coming out, we're extending incentives to both foreign investors and also to domestic investors. And so we're leveling the playing ground for everybody.
Winnie?
Yeah, I want to use a good story about Ghana for me to answer this question. Ghana has made a law to govern its petroleum sector that gives a strong role for the government to ensure that the private sector, the companies that are mining, drilling the oil, pay their fair share of taxes. It's given power to the parliament to oversee the sector, and given a role to civil society to demand and talk accountability and expose what is happening in the sector. Recently, I was at the World Economic Forum meeting in Africa, and I happened to be on a panel and raised this issue of transparency in the extractives industries. And Talo chairman got up and answered my question. My question was, why does Talo declare what it produces, what it earns in Ghana? You'll find it on the website. They are accountable. But when they come to my country, which I'm not going to mention, they do not share their contracts. They will not share the information, and we cannot know.
We are running out of time, Winnie. I'd like to get...
The answer was, Ghana requires us to do so by law. Uganda does not require us to do it by law. So, I've said that.
You mentioned
now
a slip of the tongue.
My point is
slip of the
this,
tongue.
that the
Aliko.
governments must play their part,
Agreed.
and the private sector must not have double standards.
Private sector's dying to get a word in here. Aliko.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's true. But when you look at it really in Nigeria, I think we have one of the most attractive investment policies. I mean, the policies that we have really have changed and transformed the private sector. I mean, for example, if I even had a dream 5 years ago, you told me that I'm going to go into agriculture, I would totally say no. That must have been not only a mistake, or it must have been a bad dream. But you know, today we're actually investing $2.3 billion between sugar, $2 billion, and rice, about $300 million. And this all to do with government policies, because the policy of the government is that we want to see that in the next 5 years, Nigeria produce all what they need. And we want to replicate that. In West Africa alone, the import of sugar is 4.5 million tons, but rice is worse, it's 13.2 million tons in just West Africa. And you know, we can grow rice almost anywhere. So what we are also trying to do, you talk about this financial inclusion. Yes, of course, you know, when we incubate companies, we now go ahead and list them and make sure that the people domestically are involved, whether the companies are in South Africa, and we are going to list in South Africa. So at least the downtrodden will also be part of the process, and also they will enjoy. In agriculture alone, we are going to create almost 180,000 jobs in the next 4 years. So it's part of what we are giving back to the society.
Julian?
I think the thing, we should not be worried about this aspect at all, because as foreign investment comes in, there are some skills that we don't have across Africa. And what we want is those skills to come into the region, and then for our people to be taught and learn. And therefore, we shouldn't be afraid of welcoming technology skills, capital market skills, insurance skills, all of these enabling factors. And what will then happen is our people will learn, they'll be taught, they'll grow the skill sets. But we mustn't be fearful.
Doreen, just a quick comment from you, and then Winnie, I want to touch on one other issue that I think is important. It's doing the news rounds at the moment. Doreen?
I think it's good to embrace foreign investment. It will bring about competition. Competition is good because we will improve our quality on our products or services that we're producing. I feel maybe one of the things that I've noticed back home is that we don't believe in local produced products because we are more exposed to better quality products out there. So if I can afford to buy a product or pay for a service that has better quality, I'll obviously opt for that rather than the locally produced product. However, we also need good governance. Yeah, the leaders need to make sure that the local people benefits, just as they're doing in Ghana. We should try and employ the same vision. We should all have a national vision that benefits the local person first rather than the investor.
Winnie, I want to touch on this issue. I don't want to spend much time on it, and that is the anti-gay legislation that has just been passed in Nigeria. I want to put this in the context of the African continent. 38 countries out of 54 are in agreement with this legislation. So it's a cultural issue. How do we balance cultural pressure with international pressure when it comes to human rights issues? A very short answer, and then I'm going to closing comments on the panel.
Well, there are universal norms that we adhere to, but increasingly, countries in the South are putting a challenge on how universal norms have been set or are set, because there is a different worldview from different regions, and as these regions emerge, they are saying that give us space also to write the rules of human rights. These were written before we were even born as independent nations. So some space has to be created for an interpretation of human rights that is global and that allows for specificities.
Thank you for clarification on that front. We're going to closing comments. Please, if we can, keep these short and succinct. We've got about 2 minutes left of the broadcast. President Jonathan, Africa, your vision 2050.
2050, that's about 36 years away. I believe from what I'm seeing in Nigeria, the economic growth in Africa and issues of job creation, wealth creation will be at the top.
President Mahama?
I think going forward, jobs. We just need to create jobs for the growing African population.
Winnie, it's got to be about financial inclusion for you at the top of the agenda, or am I wrong?
It's inclusion, economic, social, and political.
Julian Roberts.
If governments get the right platform, then I am absolutely confident Africa 2050 will be a dominant region in the world.
Doreen?
Well, I think in order for us to have sustainable, inclusive growth, we need to awaken the youth and make them know their responsibilities to their country. We need to coordinate through mentorship and good governance to pave them in the right direction. And finally, we need to direct them as well, so that they can, go out there and be entrepreneurial.
Mr. Dangote.
Well, my own is, I think, to say that our governments, in partnership with the government, with the private sector, we should continue to invest heavily on infrastructure, education, and also to ensure that we continue with this strong record of GDP growth, macroeconomic stability, political stability, and also trying to sort out most of the conflicts that that are happening today in Africa. Eventually, we'll end up having a very, great, united, Africa, that's very prosperous and stronger than any continent in the world.
Thank you to all my panelists for your insights. And that brings us to the end of the CNBC Africa debate. Of course, we are coming to you live from Davos, Switzerland, where the World Economic Forum is currently in session. Thank you, President.